So last week I took my first look at reactive forms in Angular, and I found them to add a bunch of ceremony above and beyond what I use, which is template-driven forms. And in response to my demo, several people pointed out that I wasn't even really using the quote-unquote reactive portions of the reactive forms. So as a fun follow-up, I wanted to see if I could create a template-driven form with a simple view model that's able to actually leverage the reactive nature of the underlying controls, but within my template-driven forms component. So to see this in action, I have my simple view model here, which again is one of the benefits that I find to template-driven forms. And my component here is going to do nothing but log a whole bunch of events. And you can see that I'm binding to things like statusChange and valueChange, and these are events that are exposed by the underlying reactive components. And I'm doing that on my form, I'm going to be doing that on my model group, and I'm going to be doing that on my, my NgModel as well. And then of course I just have a submit and a model change, which are not part of this demo, but are part of the template-driven form stuff already. Now, let's just take a look at our template. So just to set the context for the template, I have this public property form, which has pet, which has name. Okay, so let's jump over into the template. So the template has a form. I have a span here for my model group. The model group sets the name pet, which then sets up the context for the name of my NgModel, so that I can set pet name and it's being bound to the correct underlying control. Now all of that stuff that I just mentioned, that's part of the template-driven form stuff already. What's part of this experiment is this reactive bridge attribute. The reactive bridge attribute here is actually a selector for a directive that I've created for this demo, which then exposes this statusChange and valueChange event bindings. These are underlying event emitters, which we'll see in a second. But essentially what you'll see is that for the NgForm, I have Reactive Bridge that exposes status and value change. For the NgModelGroup, I have Reactive Bridge that exposes the status and the value change. And for the NgModel, I have the Reactive Bridge that again exposes the status change and value change. So let's jump over into the browser now to see what's happening before we look at what Reactive Bridge is actually doing. So if I jump over here you can see my input, the pet name, and if I refresh, what you'll see is that right away, I have the value change and status change for the NgModel, the NgModelGroup, and the form. And we can see, let's take a look at one of these events. So here we have that our previous value was undefined, our current value is Lucy, and with the status change you can see that the previous value is undefined and the current value is valid, right? The form's in a valid state, right? And these basically all say the same thing. Now if we do something like delete Lucy, what you'll see is that again we have our value change went from previous value Lucy to current value empty string. Now the empty string makes the form invalid, and you can see I can't actually submit it. And if we look at the status change on the NgModel, you'll see that the previous value was valid and it actually moved to an invalid state. And we can see this, going up the chain here, right? We can see that we're going from valid to invalid on the model group. We're also going from valid to invalid on the form itself. And you can see that output here. I'm also outputting the path of the underlying control as well. Just again, make sure that we're all looking at the same thing. And then you can see that as I type here, Maggie, again, we get this slurry of events coming out of our template. So what is the reactive bridge doing, and how is it getting access to these status change and value change events? First, what we have to understand is that the template-driven form directives are really just thin convenience layers over the underlying reactive classes. So really what this bridge is going to do is just tap into those underlying reactive classes and pipe that event stream into event emitters that are being exposed by this directive. So let's take a look. So here is my reactive bridge directive, and you can see that I actually have 3 selectors here. It'll bind to form with reactive bridge, NgModelGroup with reactive bridge, and NgModel with reactive bridge. And I'm setting this to explicit scopes as opposed to just using the reactive bridge attribute, just to make sure that I know that I always have a form, an NgModelGroup or an NgModel directive, a sibling directive that I can tap into. Because what's going to happen here is in my constructor, I'm actually going to inject either the NgForm, the NgModelGroup, or the NgModel sibling. And you can see that I'm using the self metadata here to make sure that I'm only looking on the current host for these providers. Now at any one time, only one of these is going to exist. But because of my selectors here, right, form, NgModelGroup, and NgModel, I know that one of them will exist. So essentially I can get the directive of the sibling binding by just ORing these together. So this might be undefined, and this might be undefined, but this will be valid. Or this might be undefined, and this one will be valid. And we'll just use whichever first one it finds. So essentially we're coalescing all of these injections together as a single directive. Now I'm also going to create those event emitters, right, for status change and value change. And what we're going to do is look into this sibling directive, get the underlying control, and then pipe the events into my two event emitters. So to do that, let's look at my ng on init here, and we'll see that if the control directive has a control property defined, and this is where some of this gets a little funny, NgForm and NgModel have this control defined right away, but the NgModelGroup uses some sort of asynchronous parent registration workflow where the control is not actually available at init time. So in those cases, I have to use this promise.resolve to make sure that that control is available. But anyway, let's just look at the easy case. I look at that control directive, right? It might be NgForm, it might be NgModel. I grab the underlying reactive class, and then I set up the subscriptions. The subscriptions then take that underlying control, tap into its RxJS observables for status changes and value changes, and for each one of those events that comes through, I simply pipe it into my event emitter, status change events and value change events. And these are the two event emitters here that we're binding to in our template-driven form, right? Status change and value change. Those are my status change events and value change events. And you can see here that I'm just keeping track of my previous state so that I can essentially show the change in the event itself. And that's all there is in this directive, right? The directive is doing almost nothing. It's a little bit funky because some of the logic here around the timing of the actual control directive is a little bit unclear, and took some trial and error and reading a bunch of source code on my behalf. But essentially, it's just injecting the sibling directive on the same host element. It's grabbing the control from that sibling directive. It's then binding to the event streams on that underlying control and using that to power some event stream output using the event emitter. And that's all that this is doing, and that is now exposing within my template-driven form the reactive form events so that I can then react to them within my calling context, within my component here, my template-driven forms component. Now, this may or may not be easy to leverage. Again, I don't really have a lot of reactive forms experience. Essentially, I have, let's call it generously, 1 day of reactive forms experience. But if nothing else, I think this is just an exciting exploration of the way that directives in Angular, they're kind of like React hooks on steroids, right? I mean, here I'm hooking into other directives and making those directives more powerful by exposing additional behaviors, right? So not only am I augmenting the behavior of my Angular application, I'm augmenting the behavior of other behaviors provided by my Angular application. Like, just stop and think about that for a second. That's really cool, I think, at least. And that's just part of what gets me so jazzed up about Angular. I mean, it's just powerful, and it's just flexible, and I don't know. I'm just amazed that some of this stuff actually works. So anyway, fun experiment, and a way to keep with the template-driven forms approach, but still leverage some of that underlying reactive behaviors. And I should say that, not everything here is I don't need the bridge to do a lot of things. So for example, right, I can already bind to submit. I can already get local template references. So, and then I can also bind to the NgModel changes, right? Like none of that is part of my reactive bridge. That's just part of template-driven forms. So to see, right, so I have a local template reference for form, I have a local template reference for model group, and I have a local template reference for NgModel. And then down here, we're taking those references and we're outputting the path and the valid state, right? Because there's a whole bunch of state properties exposed on these directives themselves, right? Valid, invalid, touched, dirty, pristine, errors, and a bunch like that, right? And none of that comes out of my reactive bridge. That's all just part of the template-driven forms, and I'm just outputting it here to sort of showcase the fact that these things really mesh together quite nicely. So anyway, just a fun experiment, and hopefully, if nothing else, inspired you to look deeper into the directive behaviors of Angular.